This is Sharon Terry. I'm President and CEO of Genetic Alliance, and we've been delighted to have this series essentially throughout the year, right up to year's end. We will be looking at a variety of tools and technologies that are assisting all of us in making data available and useful for research. And so without further ado, I want to introduce to you today Rich Platt, who is our speaker today. And I'll just give a very small introduction to Rich. So Rich has some great credentials, like being the principal investigator of Mini-Sentinel, which is something we've asked him to talk about today. Also, I know him most as the principal investigator of the PCORnet Coordinating Center, and he's also the professor and chair of the Department of Population Medicine for Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. I will also say that Rich is one of the most passionate individuals I know about healthcare and about creating better solutions for all of us who need those, and that includes every one of us regardless of how we're coming to this webinar, and I really appreciate working with him and look forward to continue to. So without further ado, Rich, we're going to pass you the controls, and you may begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk with all of you. I have to say that my personal experience and my sort of organizational experience in the collaborations that we've developed have been among the most fruitful that I've had the pleasure to engage in. So I just see this as another opportunity to sort of think together. I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about the emerging opportunities to do nation-scale learning about how best to improve health outcomes for our whole country, and to use the FDA's Mini-Sentinel program as sort of the worked example of that. That was partly because that was my assigned topic, but partly because it's I believe the program that is farthest along the path. So as a frame for the discussion, I use the learning health system construct that the Institute of Medicine has articulated and has been putting forward for about half a dozen years. And here's the vision for the learning health system: one that generates and applies evidence for healthcare choices. And so the notion is that we should bridge the construct of medical care being one thing and research or knowledge generation being a wholly separate enterprise, and think of them as a combined activity, one in which knowledge is generated in the course of the delivery of care, and the further thought is that that's best done if we're able to integrate learning across many organizations. There's a nice set of publications from the Institute of Medicine that talk about the fact that the healthcare system itself has to learn. What is it that we have to learn? I have to say that despite all of the very substantial progress we've made at an accelerating pace, the amount that we have to learn still dwarfs what we know. At the level of thinking about the decisions that individual patients and their providers have to make, almost every question that comes up is one for which there isn't really a solid answer. Here are some sort of everyday kinds of questions on this slide, but I'll say as a general rule of thumb, by the time you go to the second or third level question that anyone needs to make about his or her own care, the evidence becomes pretty thin. So what I've just talked about is anecdote, but there are I have to say, pretty discouraging summaries of scientific evidence that come to the conclusion that best guidelines that are assembled by expert panels routinely rely on clinician judgment rather than high-quality evidence. My good friend and colleague Rob Califf points to his own specialty of cardiology as being the one that has the most evidence, and they have less than 15% of their guidelines that are supported by high-quality evidence. The notion that we can could do better, make better use of information that is now becoming widely available through various kinds of electronic health information has surfaced in a number of domains. In biomedical research, the National Institutes of Health has called for a patient-centered research network, one that could be embedded in delivery systems that are able to conduct research that is faster, more efficient, less expensive than we do now. The public health, the whole public health enterprise has a whole array of activities that could benefit from having high-quality data that would support traditional public health measures, even though they are derived from patient care activities. Just as one example, every year the Centers for Disease Control tracks influenza as a national priority, and this sort of shows several years' worth of annual epidemic data. Most of this data is assembled by individual clinicians making individual reports to the Centers for Disease Control, which then summarizes the data instead of using electronic health information to automatically generate data that would be both easier to come by and provide richer, more useful data. If you think about the very important topic of quality improvement and quality assurance in hospitals, there's a very substantial enterprise attached to that. And for most of the measures that we care about, there are highly trained personnel who are manually collecting information that we should be able to collect in an automated way if we had the right technical resources and the appropriate knowledge on how to use that information. In the field of medication safety, which is of primary interest to the Food and Drug Administration, there's been considerable interest in trying to improve our ability to identify risks at the earliest possible time. There was a lot of discussion in about 10 years ago about how soon we could have identified what proved to be an epidemic of cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarctions, and other bad outcomes associated with Vioxx. The way the FDA had been collecting information about adverse reactions had relied almost entirely on what's called the spontaneous report system. Individual patients or clinicians or sometimes manufacturers would report to the FDA when there was a suspected adverse reaction. It's called the MedWatch program. This information is combined at the FDA into a series of analytical programs. There are hundreds of thousands of reports a year, and it's a critical piece of the FDA's safety monitoring system. And yet it failed badly for Vioxx, and it has a number of important limitations. I'll just list three because they're important motivations for trying to do something different. One is that a lot of adverse reactions are just either never appreciated or they're not reported. The second is that even for the reactions that are identified, it's hard to put them in context because there isn't good information about how many people are exposed, how vulnerable those people are to the exposure, and that means that it's not easy to know what's the risk attached to any particular outcome. And the third is it's very hard to do the attribution. How do you know that the suspected outcome wouldn't have occurred anyway or be due to the person's underlying condition? So the FDA developed a program. I'll just say that all of the examples that I gave are ones that in principle could be could be addressed or at least improved by using electronic health information. And this is more from the Institute of Medicine series on the learning health system, which pointed out that we could do great things if we had good standards, if we had appropriate governance that would allow for appropriate sharing of data, and that we had to make sure that the public understands these things. So diving into how the FDA has been building programs to try to use big data to support its mission to make appropriate regulatory decisions that allow the safest possible use of marketed medications. And it calls this program the Mini-Sentinel program. And I'm leading this Mini-Sentinel program, which is I'm pleased to be able to talk with you about it today. Congress mandated that the FDA develop a system for assessing the safety of marketed medications that would use electronic health data. And the FDA took that mandate and created the Mini-Sentinel program, which is a pilot program that has just completed a 5-year run to develop the capacity for active medical product safety surveillance. So active in this sense means compared to the passive system that the MedWatch is, that just waits for people to report things. The second is to develop first is to develop the operational capability. The second is to develop and evaluate methods to use it well. The third is to start testing its ability to evaluate safety issues of interest to the FDA, and the fourth is to assess the barriers and challenges that would come along with that. These are the organizations that participated in the Mini-Sentinel. My home shop is the lead. Then there are what we call data and scientific partners. These are organizations that bring both scientific knowledge and expertise, and also either provide care or provide insurance, and therefore have a great deal of information about the people for whom they're responsible that might be repurposed to serve the interests of medical product safety. And then there are a number of other organizations who contribute scientific expertise. There are investigators or experts in those organizations who can help refine questions and answer them. We have built a distributed database. I'll show you a cartoon of it in a moment. But the heart of this database is it now is able to identify periods of time during which, if there was an important exposure or an important medical outcome, it would be reflected in the database. That's what we mean by well-defined person time. So that it now covers about 360 million person years of data. That means if a person has 2 years worth of observation time, that's 2 person years. Or if 2 people each have 1 year of observation time, that's also 2 person years. And when you sum them all up, we're now able to ask questions of 358 million person years. People come and go in this data set, and at the moment there are 48 million who are currently accruing data. Like McDonald's, there are billions served, and there is, I show you in the last bullet, there are about 30 million people for whom there are laboratory test results. The foundation of this data system is, interestingly enough, it's administrative data. It's the kind of data that insurance companies have for everyone that they insure. And the reason we have built this system on a platform of saying we need to have the administrative data is because we want to know about this person time. We want to know when we should expect to see various things happen, if they really did happen. So we have a start date for everybody, a stop date for everybody, and then we have this utilization data and pharmacy dispensing data. And then we add to that electronic health record data when it's available. And I show you the kinds of things that we look at. when it's important to link to other kinds of information like a state immunization registry or birth certificate data, we do that. And then looping back up to the top, one of the criteria for including information as valid person time is the ability to obtain a full text record to review when that's necessary. It's rare, but when it's necessary, it's critical. So just as an order of magnitude, ordinarily we don't need the full text records at all. There are some times when exploring information from millions of people, it's necessary to have an expert review the record of a couple of hundred people to understand what's going on. The distributed data set works because in every organization that has data, the data has been transformed into a uniform format. For the institution's own operational purposes, the data lives in a whole variety of different formats, one that the organization has built that serves its purposes. For Mini-Sentinel's purposes, we ask them to take just certain kinds of data that are important to Mini-Sentinel and put it in a new format, and we call that the common data model. And it's a relational database. There are a whole series of separate tables. You can see there's an enrollment table, a demographics table, a pharmacy dispensing table, and so on. And organizations populate that database with the information that they have. Not every organization populates every table. So some organizations don't have a death table, for instance, but there's a core set of data that every organization has. I'll leave this for either for the question period or for your thinking about later about what kinds of codes we use to deal with that, because it is the nature of our healthcare delivery system that there is no uniform set of codes that every organization uses, and we've had to be thoughtful about how we navigate that situation. We put a great deal of attention to ensuring the privacy of this data, because these are data that reflect the health status and medical care of many individuals, and it's critical to ensure that there's real privacy. The key protection is that Mini-Sentinel itself never takes possession of all this individual level person data. The notion of a distributed data set is that each of these data partners, let's say my home institution of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, might be data partner number 1 in this cartoon. This transformed data set lives with all the other data, person-level data that the organization is already protecting behind its firewall. And Mini-Sentinel uses that data by sending a program that's number 2 on this slide. We send a program, and the data partner takes that program, looks at it, makes sure that it's asking a valid question, one that they think is appropriate for the Mini-Sentinel's aims of evaluating medication safety, executes that program behind a firewall, looks at the results. The results are, in the vast majority of cases, the results are simply counts. That is, there's no person-level data. A question might be, how many people were exposed to this drug, and of those people, how many had this particular outcome? Provide those 2 counts, and that's what comes back to the operations center. And each of the data partners is able to execute that same program because their data looks the same to the program and return their answers. Then we put those answers together and provide that to the FDA. The system of distributed analysis is one that is Query Health compliant. Query Health is a program that the Office of the National Coordinator established to support distributed analysis, and the software that we developed for this purpose has become one of the ONC reference standards. I'll do a quick example so you have a sense of how this actually works. There is a new class of blood thinning agents or anticoagulants that was introduced in the last couple of years, and these are thought to be considerably safer than the old standby of warfarin or Coumadin, very widely used drug for 50 years. Critically valuable drug, but one that has because its mode of action is to reduce the tendency of blood to clot. That's the reason that it's prescribed. The problem is it's very easy to overshoot the mark and to have bleeding in the form of stroke or other kind of bleeding as a complication of the therapy. So FDA was interested. There were large large trials before these new drugs were released that made them look safer, but for a variety of reasons, FDA was cared about understanding the experience when it's used in actual practice. That's partly because of a general interest and partly because that spontaneous report system that I mentioned a few minutes ago received a substantial number of reports of people who took one of these new anticoagulants. The example here is one called dabigatran, and had bleeding. Now, there are essentially no reports of bleeding on warfarin, and one reason for that is everybody knows that warfarin causes bleeding. So the drug's been around for 50 years, and there's very little reason for people who observe bleeding on warfarin to report that. So the goal here is to use this large distributed database to ask the question about comparing the rates of different kinds of strokes and gastrointestinal bleeding among people who are taking dabigatran and people who are taking warfarin, and restricting to people for whom these drugs were actually indicated, people who had a cardiac condition called atrial fibrillation or flutter. So a typical design we would use would be to say, we start by finding all the people who are new users of either warfarin or dabigatran and hadn't received one of the other drugs. In order to be able to do that, you have to be able to say, we can look back and be sure that the person hasn't taken either of these drugs for at least some period of time. And that's the FDA can specify 180 days or 365 days or something. And then we wanted to be able to say, these have to be people who had an atrial fibrillation diagnosis. So we need first of all, we have to start with all the dispensings, and then we have to find all the encounters where there would be a diagnosis for the preceding period of time. So that's emergency department, ambulatory diagnoses. We need to then follow up and say, how long were these people treated? Because we're only interested in these complications while the people are still known to be treated with either dabigatran or warfarin. So we need to determine their duration of therapy. And we also need to be able to find all the outcomes of interest, stroke or GI bleed. So the way we do that is, in the old days, so I'll say 10 years ago, if the FDA were to call, let's say us, because we were doing this kind of work with the FDA, they'd say, are you able to answer this question? We'd say, in about 6 months, we can tell you whether we can study the question. And in about 1.5 years after that, we could answer the question for you. And that's clearly not acceptable for an agency that has to make a regulatory decision about whether the drug is safe enough or not, because not to make a decision is a form of making a decision. The way we do that now is there's a first-level set of questions that we can answer pretty quickly, usually weeks, by having programs ready to go. They've already been written and tested. We know they run in all these 18 different data partners, and I'll say in air quotes, all you have to do is say, what's the question, what's the exposure, what's the outcome, who are the patients you're interested in. So the inputs to this question are, who do you care about? That's patients with atrial fibrillation. And if you like, in the question period, we can talk about how you identify those people in the data. And then the exposures are these new users, and the outcomes are first diagnoses of these outcomes, and you have to say the time period that you're interested in. And what you get out is counts of patients who are exposed, the number of days that you were watching for these outcomes, and counts of what happened to them. This uses the administrative files that I mentioned, the dispensing data, and claims data to find the diagnoses and procedures of interest. I want to emphasize the fact that this is analysis that involved information from hundreds of thousands of people, and no person-level data ever left the organization that already held the data, because all that was shared was count-level data. And the answer looks something like this. This is translated into rates per 100,000 days at risk, and it's not so important what the different bars are above dabigatran and warfarin, but you can see at a first level, what FDA took from this was dabigatran wasn't worse, which is all they wanted to know for the time being, because this was a first-level rough analysis. There are lots of things you'd like to know beyond what we were able to deal with in this particular program. And so, but the agency said, they issued a drug safety communication that said bleeding rates associated with new use of Pradaxa, that's the brand name for dabigatran, do not appear to be higher than the bleeding rates associated with new use of warfarin. And then they went on to say that that isn't the end of the question, that they're conducting more sophisticated analyses. That's what protocol-based assessment is. Rather than using a pre-written program, you design sort of new kinds of questions that can give you a more sophisticated understanding using data from the Mini-Sentinel and other databases. And just so you know, we expect in the next next 3 or 4 months to have the results of this more sophisticated analysis. Well, that takes me to saying what's relevant from Mini-Sentinel to other kinds of national priorities. And PCORnet, the activity that I've been privileged to work with Sharon on, is one of the leading examples of that. PCORnet's goal addresses one of those aims that I listed early on in this discussion. The National Institutes of Health and others envisioned the great benefit that would come of being able to harness multiple organizations together to improve our capacity to do comparative effectiveness research, and from the NIH's perspective, other kinds of research as well. PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, is focused specifically on comparative effectiveness research. The key here is to develop capabilities to do research that goes beyond the abilities of any existing single organization or set of organizations to do. And so PCORI funded 11 clinical data research networks and 8 patient-powered research networks. Those clinical data research networks cover a wide range of organizations, from academic health centers and tertiary care centers to safety net clinics, integrated delivery systems, and even the health information exchange. The patient-powered research networks are they're 18. They start as the name implies. They start with patients or patients' families who are deeply invested in specific conditions and bring both expertise and the ability to engage individuals in a way that the delivery system really can't do very well. And I'm delighted that Genetic Alliance is sort of so actively involved in the patient-powered research network sort of activities that PCORnet is undertaking. What I don't have here is a slide that shows that PCORnet is building a distributed data network that has essentially all the same high-level features as the Mini-Sentinel distributed data network. That is, each organization is taking its own data and putting it in a standard agreed-upon format, which will allow very efficient use of those data resources while still protecting privacy. Thirdly, the National Institute of Health has created the NIH Collaboratory, Healthcare Research System Collaboratory, and as part of that activity is creating a collaboratory distributed research network. And we're the coordinating center for each of these 3 distributed networks, and are therefore putting a lot of time and energy into being able to make these networks work together. So what I've shown here is there can be a large number of health plans, insurance companies, hospitals, outpatient facilities, and patient networks, and each of them can create a single infrastructure that will support multiple different networks. So in this cartoon, Mini-Sentinel is working with the organizations in pink, and PCORnet is working with the organizations in light blue, and the NIH Distributed Network is working with the organizations in slightly darker blue. So each organization can opt in or out of any of these networks, but the networks control their own governance, because the governance for PCORnet isn't and shouldn't be the same as the governance for Mini-Sentinel. And by governance, we mean partly what are the rules and regulations that apply to the work. Partly it's what are the internal agreements between organizations to work with the sponsoring organization or to work with one another, and to manage the coordination of resources. But importantly, each of these networks can share a lot of the infrastructure, data curation, and other things that are remarkably expensive and time-consuming to develop. So just as a frame of reference, we've been doing the FDA Mini-Sentinel now for 5 years, and I'd say a rule of thumb is about $10 million a year has gone into simply building and maintaining infrastructure. A big piece of that is data curation. It's a topic for a different conversation, but I want to highlight the fact that data that is created to serve the needs of clinicians and patients, even when it is perfect for that purpose, needs a great deal of attention to make it useful for this sort of large-scale use, the secondary use of supporting either epidemiologic studies or clinical trials. The same is true for data collected for to support administrative or billing purposes. This is not a question of some data being better than others. It's that data are created and optimized to serve specific purposes, and it takes a substantial effort to understand in what ways they can be used to serve these sort of other secondary purposes. And so the investment, a lot of that investment is transferable from network to network. Okay, those are my opening remarks, and I would be delighted to have your advice and input and ideas about how we might do great things together. Thanks.
And so the first question, Rich, is any collaboration or coordination planned between Mini-Sentinel and ASCO's Cancer Link?
It's in the very earliest discussion phase. So in our, I guess the answer is we would love to create one, but it doesn't exist now.
Okay, and you might say a word about what you know about Cancer Link, so people have an idea what this kind of thing looks like.
Well, I'm only an amateur on Cancer Link, but there is a process underway to try to coordinate the experience of many oncology practices in order to understand better treatment patterns and outcomes of treatment, both in terms of clinical, both desirable and undesirable clinical outcomes. And so there's an obvious synergy there between the kinds of things that Cancer Link is interested in doing, the things that Mini-Sentinel is interested in doing. This is actually a good time for me to say that FDA has, from the very outset, set as a goal to have the resources that Mini-Sentinel is building become a national resource to support other kinds of activities. And in the next, over the next several months, they've asked us to frame a mechanism for now starting to actively explore ways in which the Mini-Sentinel resources might be useful for the things they have named are biomedical research, comparative effectiveness research, quality improvement, and public health surveillance. But those are examples, not intended to be limitations. And so we'll be setting up a council of stakeholders to advise on how to do that, and there will be a series of public meetings to sort of explore how best to make these resources useful for a wide array of activities.
Super, thanks. Can you see a future in which both efficacy of interventions as well as safety would be part of this initiative?
Yes. The answer is that can happen partly because FDA has indicated that it wants to start looking at effectiveness as well as safety, and partly through these other sponsoring organizations sort of developing these mechanisms to allow the use of the resources for this purpose. I'll say that doing effectiveness research from this kind of data is more challenging than doing safety research, and the reason for that is it's always important to compare like with like, and that is, if we're trying to understand the safety profile of a drug, we'd always like to be able to say we're able to assess the outcome that a person has after exposure to a drug compared to what would have happened to that same person if they weren't exposed to that drug. For safety purposes, at least when the outcome is one that's not directly related to the indication for therapy, it's easier to conclude with confidence that the complication is maybe related to the drug. It's just harder to do that with confidence in studying effectiveness. So while we're very interested in doing it, there are a lot more caveats that have to apply to the conclusions you can draw.
Great, thanks. Next question, is data accessible to the public? Is it free of charge? How to obtain data for research purposes? And is there live support, for example, questions and answers?
Yeah. So we try very hard to be transparent about everything that we're doing. So I may not have put the Mini-Sentinel website address up there, but it's www.minisentinel.org, and all of the analyses we've done for FDA are posted there as soon as FDA releases them. In addition, when we're developing a protocol, for instance, this detailed protocol to study dabigatran and warfarin, we post the draft for public comment for a couple of weeks. The issue of who else can use the data is what's going to be covered in this set of discussions that FDA has just now initiated. Has asked us to initiate during this coming period. Remember, these are individual people's private health records, and so it's critical that that privacy be protected. And so we see no immediate prospect for making data available as such. What we do is sort of work. We would imagine that that the access for others who want to use the data would be through an agreement with the either clinical or health plan organizations that hold the data, and they would typically revolve around creating a mechanism for submitting programs that would be able to execute on the data and return answers without disclosing individual information. So it's all doable. It's a pretty big lift, but that's the discussion that'll have to take place over the near-term future about how to build that bandwidth, get the rules of the road established so everybody feels comfortable that patients' data is being protected, and the users and the organizations that would have to sort of be host to the data can manage it all.
Great, thanks. Another question, do data include infants and children?
Yeah, everybody's there. One of the things that is remarkably tricky to do, given the way our healthcare system is organized, is to link the experience of the mom during pregnancy to experience of the infant, because in our healthcare system, there are two different people, and you have to be able to establish the link. And that's one of the reasons that we link to birth certificates when it's essential to be able to make sure we can put that together. And the reason that's extremely important, of great interest to the FDA, is there's good reason to want to understand what the implications of exposures during pregnancy are, exposures to drugs and vaccines are, on not just on the outcome of the pregnancy, but on the health and well-being of the infant. So we've put a lot of energy into trying to be able to do that well, and it's still surprisingly a complicated task.
Thanks. Question and to the participants, this is the last question we have typed in here. If you have a question, please put it in. So the question about the burden of transforming the data to match or meet the data model, we're not comparable, but we've heard from other projects like CPATH that, and not so much from CPATH itself, but from the pharmaceutical companies, that it's hard to transform the data and it's expensive. What have you heard as you have worked with Mini-Sentinel from the institutions that are sharing the data about their integrating with the data model?
Yeah, it's hard and it's expensive, and it's particularly hard the first time. When I said we Mini-Sentinel spend about $10 million a year on infrastructure, a big piece of that is the cost, is reimbursing the data partners for their costs in doing these transformations. So I'd say there are several pieces to that. One is simply understanding which data are appropriate to use, and you have to have sort of deep organizational knowledge just to know among data that all of which looks fine, which of it is really appropriate to use. Then there's the doing the transformation, and that is automatable to a degree. But because the underlying systems are very dynamic, they need to be upgraded all the time. And when I say dynamic, these are usually the underlying systems are getting better, but the fact that they keep changing means that the people and the programs that are using that data for these other purposes need to be extremely attentive to those changes, and they're often not documented in the way you would expect. So I'll just give you an example of how we've gotten burned. A health delivery system that we were working with upgraded its clinical data warehouse to capture, I believe it was 9 diagnoses from an encounter, up from 6 diagnoses per encounter. So that was good. However, that information didn't come across to us as users, and it meant that all of our baseline rates were underestimated. All of our historical baseline rates underestimated the rates we were now seeing. And so we declared an epidemic of influenza in Colorado based simply on the fact that the data changed. Now, on the one hand, it was all good. On the other hand, it took a lot of work to figure out what the explanation was that I just described to you. So after the data are transformed into the common data model, every time there's a refresh, we and the data partners do a substantial amount of data checking. It never takes less than 2 weeks, and it sometimes takes several months before we are satisfied that and we run about 1,500 data checks for every refresh. And it can take up to several months before we sort of declare a refresh data set sort of appropriate quality to use to support FDA queries. So that was a long way of saying the questionnaire is correct. It's a lot of work, and that translates into a substantial expense. But that's an extremely valuable, I mean, that makes a potent case for saying it makes all the sense in the world for the data then to support multiple uses.
Terrific. And as I suspected, once I announced that was the last question, there's a couple more. So as more safety questions are studied and answered, will Mini-Sentinel.org, and by the way, we did put the URL up on the screen for the participants.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yep, there it is.
Will it maintain an online searchable library archive, and will the findings be indexed in PubMed?
Yes to the first, so you can search the website now. I ought to say the website is absolutely searchable. FDA is quite consistent in saying the information it gets from Mini-Sentinel is just one piece of information that it integrates with many other sources of information in making its regulatory decisions. So while they're committed to transparency in these results, they want to be clear that these results don't represent everything the agency knows or thinks about or gives weight to when it makes regulatory decisions. We publish a fair amount of our results in the peer-reviewed literature that PubMed indexes, but not all of it. So it'll have to be the combination of web crawlers for people who don't go directly to the Mini-Sentinel site. It'll be a combination of ways to find that. We do publish in the peer-reviewed literature what we consider to be the sort of the most important of our findings, but it's not an automatic that we publish everything. That's partly a question of what's of sufficient interest, and it's partly, frankly, just a question of bandwidth. Every report goes on our website. The best of them we try to publish in sort of a more digestible form that goes in the peer-reviewed literature.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then if someone wanted to study, do a study using Mini-Sentinel data, how would they start?
If we're talking about Mini-Sentinel, you would have to convince FDA that it wants to do this study. We currently, as Mini-Sentinel, do what FDA instructs us to do. Many of the Mini-Sentinel data partners are also part of this NIH collaboratory distributed research network. So that's another route to be able to use the Mini-Sentinel resources. Now not as Mini-Sentinel, but as the NIH Distributed Research Network Collaboratory. Since I'm the part of the coordinating center for both of them, if you have a specific idea, I'd be happy to have you write to me about it. I don't want to give the impression that it's either cheap or easy, though. While we've set up all the infrastructure that's needed to do it, the NIH hasn't provided resources actually to support the research questions themselves. So it would be a substantial discussion to actually get it going.
And so would it be your assessment then that would be one of the challenges is resources? So if you could wave a magic wand to make this even more robust and useful, would that
Yep.
That'd be one. What other magic wands might you wave?
Well, when we're working under NIH, if we're working as the NIH collaboratory, for instance, it would be important to streamline the IRB review as much as possible. IRB is Institutional Review Board, which is it talks about ensuring that there are appropriate protections of the human subjects of research, that is the people whose data are represented there, and we'd have to work through that. We'd also have to be careful about the bandwidth resources of the data partners, because every one of these activities needs real participation of the organizations whose data it is, even after we've transformed the data, even after we've said, make sure that the data that you've included in here is generally appropriate. It's still really critical to have input from people who know the organization and the care they've provided. So there needs to be this is partly sort of how big a check do you have to write, because they can't support a lot of this work gratis. But it's also just the number of people who are both knowledgeable and able to sort of devote the time to work on a new project. As part of this FDA work, we have over the years developed a sort of a clear understanding of just how many people they need to be able to support FDA's needs, and they've staffed up to do that. Can they handle one more question? Almost always. Can they take on a whole set of new questions? They'd have to plan ahead, because they would likely need to add personnel to be able to do that. So those are some of the other magic wand things.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we are finished with questions. Rich, I want to thank you again. This was really an excellent webinar. It'll be in our archives, as I've said, and I know that we will have lots of interest in it, particularly as all these different systems begin to be integrated. So thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to call people's attention to upcoming webinars. BD2K, which means Big Data to Knowledge, an NIH project looking at data overall. Decipher and Human Phenotype Ontology are upcoming, and there's a couple more that we're still in the process of scheduling, so stay tuned. Everybody who participated today will get a link with the recording archive so that you can visit it again and certainly share it widely. This will be a very useful webinar, since so many systems, as you can hear, and we're grateful that Rich is in the coordinating seat for a number of these endeavors, and that gives them some ability to be coordinated and to be robust. And as Rich said at one point during the answers, certainly email him if you have a specific question, and then if you have general questions, you can send those to us. So again, Rich, thank you very much, and thank you to our participants.